Malcolm Gladwell, welcome back to the next big idea.
I'm happy to be invited back.
Malcolm, you published your first book, The Tipping Point, in 2000. So it's coming up on its 25th anniversary. And the book itself benefited from a kind of tipping point effect. It sold millions of copies and spent 8 years on the New York Times bestseller list. What do you think it was that triggered that tipping point contagion?
I don't have a good. I think it was the first in a not the first. It was one of the pioneers in what has become a very popular genre of nonfiction, which is these kinds of big idea books. It was by no means did I invent the big idea book, but I feel like there was a cluster of big idea books around that time that all did very, very well. Guns, Germs, and Steel,
Oh, yes.
for
Yes.
example, or there was my book, and there was a couple of them that I think tapped into something in the culture that was a lot of people, the reading public was a lot better educated, more sophisticated than in previous generations, for obvious reasons. People, way more people are going to college, way more. And there was a kind of hunger for, a real appetite for consuming kind of ideas from the world of science and for applying academic ideas to everyday life and for just that kind of, when you know your audience is sophisticated and educated, you can write in a different way. And I think that's what was going on.
Yeah.
Um,
And what was the thesis of the tipping point, and why did you decide to revisit it now, a quarter century later?
well, the idea of the tipping point was simply that the metaphor was the epidemic metaphor was a really useful way of making sense of ideas and behaviors and how they spread, and which at the time now is a commonplace notion, but at the time was reasonably novel.
Mm-hmm.
People had used that term. We would talk about an epidemic of crime, but we really only meant it it was just a kind of stray phrase.
Right.
People weren't really thinking that, oh, no, it's an epidemic. It's
Yeah.
contagious behavior that spreads like the flu, And there had been this movement in academia to kind of turn the metaphor into something literal. And that's what I was writing about. I was saying, let's think about that term literally. And now, I think it's a commonplace. I think
Yeah.
I no longer need, half of the tipping point was trying to convince the reader that what they had thought of as a metaphor was actually literal. I don't
Right.
think you need to convince people anymore. Now I think what we're ready for is a more kind of sophisticated and nuanced reading of
Yeah.
how epidemics work. And that's what this book is.
And there was something empowering there. You wrote in the original book, with the slightest push in just the right place, it can be tipped. This sense of kind of butterfly effects that potentially, if we understand things adequately, we can have this outsized impact. But of course, so often those initial triggers are unintentional, right?
Yeah.
But we want to learn to be intentional, to be more intentional about both the triggering and maybe containing contagions when they're pernicious. Is that where does the revenge of the tipping point come in? How did revenge get into the title of this sequel?
Well, I do spend a lot more time in the sequel talking about the ways I think the rules of epidemics and the lessons of epidemics have been applied by less than savory characters or for less than positive ends. And so it's a little bit on the dark side this time. Not all of it, but a lot of the book is kind of, I think that a lot of these ideas have been hijacked. For example, the book begins and ends with a discussion of the opioid crisis and Purdue's behavior, Purdue's sort of dark genius is in this
Yeah.
kind of very explicit use of epidemic ideas to spread OxyContin. I mean, they were
Yeah.
more than open about it. They were like, it was a kind of, they took their marching orders from the rules of epidemics when it came to trying to influence doctors.
Right. Exactly. In triggering an epidemic with with actual addictive, contagious dynamics, but the super spreader strategies that were employed with the help of McKinsey were very intentionally using this, taking advantage of those dynamics. When I first heard the title, I thought, I smiled. I think in part because I loved as a child the Pink Panther series. I think of Revenge of the Pink Panther.
Oh yeah.
But I also thought, I had a series of thoughts. One was Malcolm must be addressing the amplification of tipping point dynamics that social media created in the years following the publication of the tipping point. Because, of course, the tipping point ended up being incredibly prescient, right? I mean, the phrase going viral went mainstream after the launch probably of Facebook in 2004, Twitter in 2006, iPhone in 2007. We had Me Too, Black Lives Matter, QAnon. But that's not the focus of the book. But do you think technology made tipping points easier to initiate and sort of more precarious?
Maybe. I mean, you're right. No one is less interested in social media than me as a book topic. I just sort of feel like there's no element of our life that has consumed so much attention. So some of it unwarranted, some of it warranted, some of it don't. The world did not need me to weigh in on Twitter and Facebook. Yeah. So I kind of scrupulously avoided them. Do I think they play a role in amplifying? Sure. Although I've always objected to the line of reasoning that says that social media has a kind of life of its own. I just don't think that's. I think that it is. Maybe it's a bit of an accelerant. But the person who is, for example, hugely central in social networks and socially influential in a world without social media is still plays that role with social media, but maybe the reach is a little bit greater, you know, or maybe, the dynamics of contagion, of spreading an idea, speed up with social media. Although, if you look back in pre-social media days, ideas spread pretty quickly back then too. So even that one's. So I just think there's, I think what it's doing is it's illuminating social processes that may have been a little bit obscure before. Maybe that's really what it's doing. But and to the extent that I wrote a piece for the New Yorker that at the time people took umbrage at, but I feel like I was utterly vindicated. It was this attack on Twitter right around the time of Arab Spring. And, because there was this argument that Twitter was going to enable the disenfranchised to rise up against their oppressors. And social media was this kind of going to be, Twitter and other forms of social media, Facebook, were going to be this great liberation tool. Yeah. And of course, it's just complete and utter nonsense. And in fact, what they were doing was they were distracting revolutionaries from the hard work of building grassroots movements. Yeah. People were sitting at home tweeting when they should have been out in the streets doing the kind of organizing that previous generations of social activists did. King spends 10 years building his movement before he gets to Birmingham in 1963. Right. Fidel Castro spends, I don't know how many years, probably roughly the same. I go on and on and on and on. So, that was a completely false promise. So I was so, by the time I came to writing this book, the one part of it I didn't feel I needed to update was the fact that the first tipping point was written before the age of social media. Don't think that's terribly significant in the end.
And it sounds like this book ended up being somewhat more ambitious or novel than you expected, because you kind of, in your research, it seems like stumbled upon three new principles of social contagion, right? Super spreaders, the magic third, and overstories.
Yeah.
So interesting. Why don't we start with overstories? Because it seems to be most central to your broader thesis.
Yeah.
What is the overstory?
So I got quite taken by this field of research starts in medicine, and it looks at differences in how doctors behave from one community to the next. And there had been this assumption in the world of medicine that the things that drove differences in doctor behavior were obvious ones. Doctors in rich towns at big wealthy hospitals would use more technology and be more likely to intervene and what have you. And in poor places, there will be less healthcare. So the first time that someone tries to verify this assumption is in the 1960s, a guy named John Wenberg, and discovers it's totally not true. First of all, that variations don't follow kind of predictable socioeconomic patterns. They just seem to be random. And secondly, that they're not small, they're enormous. And he does this famous study of Vermont in the 60s where he looks at Stowe and Waterbury, two kind of adjoining towns. And in one place, almost no kids get their tonsils out. And then you drive down the road 10 miles and all the kids have their tonsils out. And he couldn't explain it. It's like, honestly, this is so weird. And then he goes and he starts an entire field in medicine which studies variation. And now we know that this is one of the most robust observations about medicine, that there are just these massive local differences in how medicine's practiced. And I give the example in my book of some research that looked at Boulder versus Buffalo.
Mm-hmm.
Boulder is a certain kind of cardiac procedure that you would get if you have a heart attack, that you would get all the time in Boulder and none of the time in Buffalo, right? And it's not because Buffalo's a backwater. Buffalo's not a backwater. Buffalo probably has a better hospital than Boulder. It's nothing to do. It's got nothing to do with money and nothing to do with the training of. In some ways, in fact, nothing to do with openness to new technology. Because in some ways, you would think Boulder was the kind of tech-focused, innovative place. But in fact, there are some key innovations in cardiac care where Buffalo was way ahead of Boulder. Doesn't follow these patterns. It's just this weird random thing that something's in the air in Buffalo is different from what's in the air in Boulder. And I find this such a fascinating observation. And my thought was, this can't just be just about medicine. That there must be a set of norms and values that communities create for themselves that have the effect of guiding the behavior of those who live within those communities. And that's an interesting idea because you're clearly describing a contagious process. And there's some of the work in medical variation very clearly points to contagion is at work. I move. If we look at doctors who move to a different town, they start to behave just like the doctors in the town they moved to. It happens very quickly. It just looks like you're catching the flu. And that's interesting to me because if it's contagion that respects borders, which I found that it flies in the face of all of our intuitions about what a contagion is.
Yeah.
Right? A virus is not supposed to respect borders. So, what do you do with a case where the contagion stops at the city limit?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah. And actually, it's another reminder of actually the maybe the absence of the ubiquity or the overstatement of the ubiquity of sort of digital communication, because if we were communicating perfectly without physical boundaries, we would have the same practices in Boulder and Buffalo.
Yes.
But there's a wonderful double entendre in this notion of the overstory, right? Because it's both sort of the grand story that we tell ourselves about ourselves, which is a wonderful line. We had Michael Lewis, your friend Michael Lewis, on the show recently, and he talks about the importance of the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. And I think he was talking about that as it relates to individuals.
Mhm.
But I think your point about overstories expands this to groups, that the stories we tell ourselves as teams, as companies, as nations about ourselves, these stories matter deeply, and we're often unaware of them.
Yeah. Yeah. No, there's two key. First of all, it's funny that Michael, Michael, who's writing, I think he's second to none, is a nonfiction storyteller.
Yeah.
But it's hilarious, of course, that he's all about character, individual character. Like,
Yeah.
he's so relentlessly focused on the subject of his story and leads you through the story, through the subject's eyes. I am not that. I'm someone who's much more interested in the group, in the environment, in the setting. We are, this is the classic dichotomy that's been observed in cross-cultural studies of Western and Asian people. That, the famous study about the goldfish bowl. You have a fishbowl full of fish with one really, really large fish and lots of small ones and rocks and trees and stuff. You show it to a group of Western students and you just have them look at it. Then you take them and say, describe what you saw. And they say, I saw a fishbowl with one very large, orange fish with these spectacular fins and blah, blah. You do it to a group of Asian kids, they describe everything but the big fish.
So interesting.
They describe the rocks and the trees and the little fish. So I'm Asian, Michael's Western. I think that's a very good way. So, of course, I would be drawn to the collective stories that we tell and how they influence us.
Right. But both of you just delight in stories. I mean, the joy that you take in telling stories. And I mean, you've said, of course, that, Michael Lewis has this incredible ability to sustain a single story over the course of an entire book, which is not something that you would do. But, so you tend to have books full of many highly colorful, highly engaging stories. But I think for both you and Michael Lewis, as a reader, what I experience is this author is laughing to himself as he writes. Right?
Yeah.
There's a
we
joy.
do enjoy ourselves.
There's a joy in the process.
Yeah.
It's palpable.
Yeah. Michael's other thing that he does is he lets the subject tell their own story. He takes them at their word. Yeah. Which is a very, very difficult and beautiful thing to do. Yeah. And it's why I thought the criticism of his Sam Bankman-Fried book was so misplaced. Yeah. He's giving you something you will not get from anyone else. He's giving you Sam Bankman-Fried through the eyes of Sam Bankman-Fried. Yeah. Right? Yeah. Which is like, that's what he always gives us. And that's the genius of it. You're never going to get a clean shot at SBF except if it comes from Michael. Right. Everything else is going to be tainted through the eyes of the observer. And anyway, I think many people who read that book did not understand that that's what it was intended to be.
Well, we hope they'll understand that better after listening to our conversation on the topic, because we went deep into that, and he was fantastic, as you could imagine. But I think as we think about overstories, your case study of Miami before and after 1980 is talk about colorful stories. Is an extraordinary example of the power of an overstory, because the change was so sudden. What happened in Miami in 1980?
Yeah. So I have a chapter where I'm trying to explain why Miami is such an outlier when it comes to fraud, criminality, particularly fraud. And I focus on Medicare fraud, which is a huge. I mean, it's the dominant mode of economic fraud in this country. But there are other indices as well. But Miami, when it comes to Medicare fraud, is just off the charts. I mean, no one else is close. Yeah. And it's just Miami. It's not South Florida. It's not Fort Lauderdale. Fort Lauderdale's normal. Boca's normal. Homestead's normal. Miami's not. So you're faced with this problem. It's a classic. First of all, that's what you would expect from the medical variation literature, but it's weird. Right. So why is Miami Miami? And that whole chapter is about a story of a guy who moves, a nursing home operator who was an upstanding citizen in Chicago, moves to Miami and gets involved in one of the biggest Medicare frauds of all time. And his rabbi gets up at his sentencing hearing and says exactly that. This guy was fine when he was in Chicago, and then he came here and he's not. Basically, the rabbi says it's Miami's fault, and I agree with the rabbi.
Right.
It's Miami's fault. So what happens in Miami? Well, Miami. So I fell in love with this book.
Yeah.
God, I've forgotten the name of the book.
I have it here. Wait a second here. It's
Is it
Nicholas Griffin's The Year of Dangerous Days.
Yes,
Yep.
Nicholas Griffin's So I fell in love with Nicholas Griffin's The Year of Dangerous Days, which is a book which attempts to explain why Miami's Miami. And his argument is, before the kind of 70s, it's just a normal, sleepy, not very successful southern town. It's Jacksonville.
Yeah.
Its heyday as a tourist destination is over. People aren't going to Miami. They're not going to Miami. Miami Beach is a pit. It's like people are going to Orlando or they're going to the Caribbean. It's struggling. It's basically a failed version of Jacksonville, right? That's what it is. And then all of a sudden in the late 70s, Griffin argues, 3 things happen. One is the Cuban boat lift. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people escape Cuba and come to Miami in the space of a month. 2, there's a massive race riot, one of the worst race riots of that entire era. And 3, there is the sudden emergence of the cocaine trade, which floods the city with extraordinary amounts of cash. I mean, just to a level of, before we have effective measures in place to limit money laundering. So like people are wheeling in suitcases of cash into banks every day in downtown Miami. I mean, it's just like a preposterous situation.
You say in the book, in 1980 alone, 12 people deposited between $250 million and $500 million each into Miami banks. The bank staff is helping to bring suitcases full of cash.
Yeah, they're coming out and helping them
physically into the bank.
So heavy.
So the banking system becomes totally complicit. $11 billion in drug money, I think, in 1980.
I mean, it's just hilarious. So you have this city gets 3 shocks to the system, that all have the same effect of shaking the city's institutions to their core. So the police get corrupted by the drug money. The courts get corrupted by the drug money. The influx of newcomers just means that the city's culture, like hundreds of thousands of, because of the race riot, hundreds of thousands of white Miamians flee north to the northern suburbs, and they're replaced by a bunch of Cubans who, nothing wrong with the Cubans, but they're just different. I mean, you just changed your city. You've implanted an entirely new group, and you've removed an entirely different group at the same time as you've taken the traditional institutions and you've turned them upside down.
That's right. And you say Miami at the time has a population of 300,000, 125,000 Cubans, refugees, arrive in Miami.
Yeah.
It's an astonishing number.
It's astonishing. And the city, they stay in Miami, and Miami is so kind of, I'm amazed that it wasn't a bigger, I was trying to, first of all, I was alive then, in high school, and I have a memory of this, but I was astonished in retrospect it wasn't a bigger deal. I feel like today, if 125,000, I mean, we had a version of this, but not as concentrated in such a short time in those kinds of numbers. I just feel like it was this, and in combination with the explosion of the cocaine trade and this massive race riot. I mean, it's just like, it's weird. Like, I just feel like it should have been a bigger deal and wasn't. But what you're left with was a city that kind of changes its, I call it the overstory, this collection of ideas that communities tell themselves. I call out the overstory. Miami gets an entirely new overstory in 1979 that is very permissive of people shaving the edges off their behavior. And that's the world in which my Chicago nursing home operator, Philip Esformes, enters. And as the rabbi said, Miami corrupts him.
And here I have a description of Philip Esformes, who's the heir to this nursing home empire. Tanned and movie star handsome, he drove a $1.6 million Ferrari Aperta, flew private. He has these screaming fits. He insists on calling cash fettuccine. Right. He has liaisons in hotels with beautiful women. I had to Google him and the Ferrari Aperta just to get a visual from as I was reading. So this story is a film waiting to be made. He gets away with more than $1 billion of Medicare fraud. They're handing out $300,000 to $400,000 per month in cash in kickbacks. Right, right. So this is just hilarious. An insane operation.
But it's very like the fascinating thing. So I was interested in a bunch of different things there. One is the extent to which you kind of unconsciously absorb norms from the overstory in any community. But the other thing that interests me was the idea that the overstory can change. So I think if I explain to you the idea that there are a set of norms that govern your community, I think our first impulse would be to think of that as being something pretty stable.
Yeah.
Right? I was listening to some podcast yesterday with this German guy who founded Shopify. And he was talking about the differences, which is a Canadian company.
Yeah.
He's talking about the differences between Germans and Canadians. And what was interesting about that conversation was that you could have had that conversation about the differences between those two cultures 100 years ago, and it would have been exactly the same.
Interesting.
Right? He was talking about culture as something relatively impermeable to influence. The Germans, he's making these sort of interesting and insightful points, but like Germans are intolerant of anything. He said, in the normal continuum, on one end there's bad, on the other end there's excellent, and then in the middle there's pretty good. And he was saying Germans only play at the one end of that continuum. They start at pretty good and go all the way to excellent. And if they have no time or way to understand anything that falls below that, and he was saying Americans, by contrast, will entertain the full range, which is why Americans are so much better at innovation, because they're accepting of the fact that in the beginning, what you're doing may be terrible, may not work yet. And they're fine with that because they have a sense that, oh, no, we can move up and down the continuum. The Germans don't. It's interesting, very interesting thought.
Yeah.
But he was saying it's also the root of the great tradition of fine German craftsmanship, that what you're really good at is doing something you've been doing for years because you will perfect it to this. Now, my point is, he could have said that in 1924, and it would have made perfect sense to us, right? That's our implicit notion of what culture is. But the Miami example is this kind of fascinating example of, no, it changes.
Yeah.
It's like they wake up one morning in 1980 and they're a different city. That's interesting. And I later go in in the balance of the book, talk a lot about the circumstances under which overstories change.
Yeah, yeah. No, this fascinates me. I mean, this notion of I've always been interested in phase transitions in physics, the movement from gas to water to ice, and how quickly that happens, right, at different thresholds. And one can see this maybe happening with these cultural transitions, and maybe we can see it in Miami in 1980. That you point out that they're all of a sudden they're traffic cops asking for bribes. There's, at the time, I guess that, Philip Esformes is executing this, massive $1 billion Medicare fraud. Now we have Rick Scott, the sitting Florida senator, who was CEO of a big hospital chain that was forced to pay $1.7 billion in civil settlements for fraud that occurred in Florida. Mm-hmm. And he resigns in disgrace, becomes a senator from Florida. But one can see how in that context and environment, one could look to your left and to your right and say, wow, there are all these people making tens of millions of dollars from Medicare fraud and driving Ferraris, and our senator has benefited, and this is just the way the world works, and it's a might makes right moral code.
Yeah.
That the strong take from the weak, and it's better to be strong, right? And is that the way you see it? That one can have this kind of shift of it's almost like a game theory shift of strategy based on how the other players are acting.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about it in that way, but I think that's probably a good part of the. I thought of it more as there are just these exogenous shocks to the system and sometimes often they are unanticipated and unintentional, but they just force us to kind of recalibrate who we are and what we're, to go back to the Canadian example, Canada and Australia alone among Western nations have absorbed astonishing numbers of immigrants in the last 25 years.
Yeah.
And in the same conversation, this guy from Germany he was talking about Canada now. He was saying to him that is the most astonishing thing about Canadian culture, that it's managed to keep absorbing millions of outsiders, of immigrants, and still welcome them. The nativism actually is just happening now, is sort of starting to kick in. But his worry was, and anyone looking at that, you would say, it can't go on forever, right? You know that there's going to be a point where people will say enough. We may now be finally getting there after the country's now, I think the majority of Canadians are now not born in Canada, which is an extraordinary thing for a kind of wealthy, settled. But like that, we do, we have a, that's not something that people weren't intending. It wasn't, no one who was pro-immigration was intending to trigger the moment when Canadians turned and became hostile to immigration, right? It just kind of happens. And when does it happen? We don't really know. We just know that there's a certain point where there is this kind of reshuffling of people's sense of identity, and that will inevitably come at some point. And that, I think of that way of thinking about overstory shifts is might be more accurate. Yeah.
Well, so to close the loop on the Miami story, so Philip Esformes is there's a big trial over this $1 billion Medicare fraud. He's sentenced to 20 years in prison in 2019. Then Donald Trump grants him clemency a year later in 2020. Donald Trump, of course, who has his own relationship with the state of Florida.
Right? I know.
So
it's
the
Florida.
The Florida sensibility extends to one of our presidential candidates, and maybe beyond the confines of Florida.
Yeah, it's a weird place. It's funny. I forget whether I tell that joke. Why in the book? Why do Latin Americans like Florida so much? Because it's so close to the United States. The the idea that it is sui generis. It is not a typical American city. There's no other American city even remotely like it. Even if you think about San Diego, which is a city similarly situated very, very close to a place where we get lots of immigrants from. But San Diego is not an outlier city. San Diego, in many ways, is the kind of quintessential conservative Southern California town, right? It's like weird. Like it's not become Mexicanified, but Miami somehow had a fascinating different relationship to its border.
I'm tempted to push back a little bit on the suggested causality of Philip Esformes moves to Florida and becomes corrupt, because of course his father, who built this nursing home empire, was already a bit of a fraudster in Chicago, right?
Oh, no, right. So here I'm going to get in the weeds with you.
Okay.
I've always wanted to do something on there. Nursing home industry is the weirdest. It's more regulated than the nuclear power industry. It is on a level that you can't, like, it's just impossible. And secondly, the invitation that you can call, depending on how closely you want to look at anyone's nursing home, you can call them a fraud. It's like there's so much going on. There's so many regulations. It's so inherently kind of shady. If you think about a situation like this, that nursing home operators sometimes fill their beds if they need their beds filled with homeless people, right? Now, you could say, oh, they're cycling in homeless people and pretending they're patients. Or you could say, well, actually, homeless people often have mental illness problems and need to be in some kind of assisted living situation. That's what we want these guys to do. Now, if you go to nursing home people and you say, well, what should we be doing with homeless people? You get 10 different answers. And the same people who, in one context, rail about our indifference to the homeless will, in the same breath, accuse nursing home operators of fraud if they shuttle in guys off the street and put them in their beds.
Right.
So, I'm not defending nursing homes.
Right.
I'm not saying that Philip Esformes was not engaged in some highly questionable activities.
Right.
I'm just saying that,
right.
There's a point where I have a little bit of sympathy for people who try to enter that world.
Yeah.
It's a nutso world. It's the craziest business in America. So the dad, he's a slick operator, but the dad also moves to Miami. I mean, so he found a welcome home there.
He said he sat down for an interview with two reporters. This is the father, Morris Esformes, who were investigating his business, and he told them a council of rabbis in Israel has already agreed to absolve him of the spiritual consequences if any harm comes to them. Right. So
he was wearing a Los Angeles Lakers outfit and a yarmulke. He's
right.
Fantastic. These guys are fantastic.
Yeah. Well, although maybe there's small area variation, which is the term applied to this kind of phenomenon you were talking about, between Stowe and the neighboring village in Vermont of very different behaviors in different locations. The small area variation might also include Chicago as a source of corruption, which, according to political scientists at the University of Illinois, called Chicago the most corrupt metropolitan area in the country on a per capita basis. Now, I'm not sure
political corruption.
How they measure that. That's probably political corruption.
Yeah. No, Chicago. I could have done a whole chapter on Chicago,
right?
Which is colorful in its own right.
But
no, it's an enormously fun. I sort of think that the right spirit in that chapter was written in the spirit of, I don't know why this is weird.
Yeah.
There's no one can give you a definitive answer. So let's enjoy ourselves and speculate with, and also the fun speculation, not the fun. The other fun thing is, I'm not trying to absolve Philip Esformes of all of his guilt, but we should do the same thing with, when it comes to kind of petty crime, we talk about low-level stuff, poor people. We talk about the environment all the time. But somehow we think that by virtue of becoming rich, someone becomes immune to the kind of pressures of their environment and context. They don't. They also have their own, and known patterns of criminality that arise out of their own environments. And pretty easy to, when you're jetting around Miami Beach in a $1.6 million Ferrari Aperta, pretty easy to feel like you are above the law.
Yes. And you actually go in with this task force of people, the Miami Medicare Fraud Strike Force, right? You get into their government issued Chevrolet, and you go and tour this office park, right, which is full of dozens and dozens, maybe hundreds of Medicare scam fronts.
Yeah.
What was that experience like?
It's hilarious. So meet these two guys. The government. The problem with Medicare is that it's very difficult to police people who want to scam the system, because you can't. It's such a vast system And the way medicine works is you have to pay up front. You can't make doctors providing expensive, legitimate care wait months and months and months for their payments. Right? The whole system would collapse. So what we do is we pay first and we ask questions later.
Mm-hmm.
And it's basically a system based on trust, at least initially. So the only way to kind of crack down on fraud is you go in after the fact and you look for patterns and try and find the people before they disappear. And so what you have in Miami are lots of people who set up these little Medicare shops. You need to have a physical mailing address if you're going to be a Medicare beneficiary, Medicare provider. And they set up these little shops. They use any number of fraudulent schemes to acquire a group of patients. They bill Medicare, they pocket the money, and then they disappear. So what we went to was the office building where they all have their physical address. So imagine a standard-looking office building in a kind of nice suburban part of Miami. You drive into the parking lot, and you realize you walk into what looks like a normal lobby, and you realize that every office is the size of a broom closet, and that there are hundreds of offices, most of them empty, but some of them just have one, typically a woman, sitting there, who probably doesn't speak English, who doesn't seem to know why she's there. And the office will have nothing in it. It's just her. Telephone's not plugged in. This just like cheap art on the walls, nothing on the desk. And she's just sitting there. And that's a Medicare, that's a fraudulent Medicare operation.
Yeah, and there's like a computer screen and the mouse wire is not plugged into the computer.
It's just hilarious. It's
just so transparent. And you can see, and there are hundreds of these places, right? So you can imagine how it's a little bit like when everyone's driving 10 or 15 miles over the speed limit on the highway and you're like, well, I'm not going to be the only one going backwards here. I mean, this is where you can see this kind of shift of norms, how that could affect what you call the overstory.
It's a lot. I mean, if you've been dealing drugs, this is so much better. I mean, you're not risking your life. The chances of getting caught are much less. If you do get caught, you're not, the penalties for drug dealing are draconian, and they're not for Medicare fraud. And, it's a simple scam. You're in, you're out. And then a weird fact that I don't go into in this is an incredible percentage of the fraudsters are Cuban. It's the Cubans. It's the Cubans. A little, there's a famous sociology paper from the 60s called by, what's his name? The famous New York sociologist. It was called The Ethnic Theory of Crime. And it was an explanation of the, long observed phenomenon that different ethnic groups specialize in different areas of crime, right? The mafia would be one example, but you can get very, very specific. And Cubans, Medicare fraud is like a Cuban specialty.
Interesting. And how about positive overstories, right? Because this is really what great company cultures are, right? Is stories that we collectively tell ourselves about ourselves. I'm curious. You spent 10 years at the Washington Post as a reporter. A lot of people don't know this, and another 10 years at the New Yorker before writing The Tipping Point. Were there overstories at those publications that were part of those cultures that helped you become who you became as a writer?
Yeah, I mean, I was at the Washington Post between 87 and 96. When the people who were around for Watergate were still there. When Woodward was, 10 feet from me when I first started the Washington Post. And so there was this kind of, and I think Watergate and Ben Bradley, who was still there when I was there, the famous editor of the Washington Post, had created in that moment, in that kind of historic, extraordinary kind of showdown between a president and a newspaper, had created a kind of mythology, an overstory for the Washington Post, which was that they were the reporter's paper. This was a place where great reporters came and were given the freedom to do whatever they wanted, really. I mean, to take enormous risks, to disappear for months on a project, that was there was and all of the kind of, the overstory had additional elements in that. So the reporter is the hero. The institutions that they report on are the enemy. I don't mean that in a kind of the way we would talk about that today, but your job was not to cozy up to those people. Your job was to hold them to the fire. That was the kind of part of the. There was a real kind of swagger to the place. It was like a high testosterone kind of.
Interesting.
Which was enormously for a young 23-year-old. It was an incredibly fascinating place to work, and all these role models of, if you think about the people who were there, an entire generation of incredibly successful writers came out of that. Nick Lemon, Woodward, Bernstein, David Hoffman, Rick Atkinson, David Marinis, Wilbon and Tony Kornheiser and Michael Wilbon were on the sports side. I mean, I could go on. It's this list is as long as your arm. They were all products of this kind of place that told you were not just a star, but you were crucial in some way to the functioning of government in Washington. And that's not what you get today working at a big city newspaper.
Yeah. It's interesting. Your description of the power of overstories reminded me of my life was changed by a summer camp I went to in Vermont. And you'd arrive, and I was a camper and then later a counselor there. You'd arrive, and within a week, the young campers would learn, okay, this is a place where we're funny, but not at other people's expense. One of the sayings there was, there are many ways to be a man, like manhood is more broadly defined. Mm-hmm. And we celebrate our differences, really celebrate them, and we're collectively better because of them. And I'd come from all this very intense, kind of competitive schools that were not that way at all, And it was transformative for me because I thought, wow, collections of humans can interact in totally different ways. Mm-hmm. And so when my son, who's now 16, went there, I said, look, this is a place where kids aren't sarcastic and they don't make fun of each other. And he said, Dad, there's this thing called human nature. You might have heard of it. No such place exists. And then his first letter back to me was, it's exactly like you described. And I think this notion that, that human beings can interact in radically different ways because of the overstory, because of these kinds of cultural environments, and that can persist in the case of this camp for decades and decades and decades. It's powerful.
That is fascinating. Yeah, that's really fascinating.
Well, let's talk about the magic third, which is another kind of new concept, at least new to me, that you introduce in the book, which you say looks a lot like a universal law.
Mm-hmm. I love me a universal law.
Yes. And this one feels like an insight that potentially has really practical applications to how we operate. Where should we start on the magic third?
Well, I start with white flight in the 60s. Sort of what happened in those neighborhoods that turned from white to black almost overnight. And it was what you discover when you look closely at these is that it was not the case that one black family moves in and every white family moves out. That if a community was going to remain stable, it didn't need to exclude all outsiders. Rather, what caused instability was when the level of outsiders reached a certain point, a tipping point, if you like, where suddenly they were in sufficient numbers that people's perceptions of them changed. They became threatening, or and so the question is, what is that threshold? And so then I began looking at analogous cases where you have a dominant group that is exposed to outsiders, and where you ask the question, how many outsiders does it take to move the culture of the dominant group? And it's never one, right? It's not one person walking in that makes a difference. So I look at all the research done on women on corporate boards. You have a 9-person board. You got all bunch of white guys. You think we need desperately to have some women. You bring in a woman. Does that change the composition of the board in terms of how it thinks? And no. You bring in 2. Does that change it? No. You bring in 3. Does that change it? Yes. Now that sounds incredibly simplistic, but I called up countless women who'd served on boards and asked them this exact question, and they all said the same thing, which is, when it was just me, nothing changed. I was ignored. I was, I wasn't able to influence anything. No one listened to me. 2 was better, but didn't. When we got to 3, all of a sudden, we were large enough that people stood up and noticed. And so I sort of began to put all this together, and there is some really fascinating psychological work by a guy named Damon Centola who tries to reproduce this effect in the laboratory to great effect. Yeah. And basically it says that, like, this is a nonlinear threshold phenomenon, and when outsiders have critical mass, they are capable of transforming the culture of the larger group, and they don't need to get to 51% to do that. You can do it at a third. Right. You can even sometimes do it at a quarter. That's how. And so when you hear that, all of a sudden lots of otherwise mysterious social phenomena start to make sense. Yeah. Because you realize you don't need, to use a tired example, the rise of Trump doesn't mean that 51% of Americans agree with Trump. That can be propelled, our view of him can be propelled by a small group of people who are just at sufficient critical mass to change the conversation.
And this is important in the case of women on boards, because research shows that having women on corporate boards makes those companies better. Women ask more difficult questions. They're more collaborative. They're better listeners, right? So this is really a practical possible change. You also have this incredible example of the early childhood longitudinal study, which has showed a widening gap between white kids and black kids on math tests, where black kids make up less than 5% of the class. But when the percentage of black kids in the class exceeds 25%, the gap completely vanishes. All kids are performing at the same higher level, which is extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean, it's this really tantalizing finding that I feel like I don't know exactly what it means, but it does. But basically, what it's showing is that the performance of disadvantaged kids in a classroom is acutely sensitive to how many of their own they're surrounded by. Yeah, and that an individual's academic achievement is a function of 2 things. It's a function of their own abilities, and it's a function of the shape and size of their cohort. How many people are like them in the class? And you can't measure one and not the other. You have to look at both those things in combination. And that, I think, we spend so much time thinking about the individual contribution to achievement that we forget that there are these other group dynamics at play that may be important.
Yeah. I wonder if the magic third operates not just in classrooms, but also in the overstory. And an example might be, you point out that we've had an incredible growth in the number of CEOs of leading tech companies who are of Indian descent, right? The CEOs of Google, Microsoft, IBM are all Indian. There's 60 CEOs of Indian descent leading Fortune 500 companies, you say. I wonder if it's possible that the effect of this on ambitious young Indian Americans in the tech sector or in business more broadly might not be similar to the effect on women in corporate boards, and that reach a certain. I mean, that they see in the broader cultural context, in the media and everywhere else. Hey, this is if that magic third doesn't operate on the level of the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think there's something. It all goes down to this. The importance of critical mass and understanding this kind of phase change that happens when a group reaches a certain size. Like that, I don't know why this notion is so difficult for us. I do think it is difficult for us to factor in that we just are not. We're so wrapped up in evaluating the individual as an individual that we're just kind of, we somehow turn a blind eye to the kind of sea in which they're swimming.
Yeah. We see the fish. We see the fish and not the fishbowl.
Yeah, and I think I bring up in that one of those chapters, I talk about a little bit about affirmative action and how during one of the crucial Supreme Court cases on affirmative action, the colleges were there trying to defend their policies, and the justices kept saying, you guys keep saying you want to have a certain number of, you're doing this because you think it's important to have a certain number of minorities on your campus in order for them to, contribute meaningfully to the school.
Yeah.
What's the number?
Yeah.
And they won't answer the question for all kinds of tactical legal reasons. And it pisses the justices off, and they ultimately get rid of affirmative action entirely, on the quite defensible grounds that if you can't tell me why you want to let in so many black people, why would I let you change your rules to let in black people? Right? That's basically their position.
Mm-hmm.
And the colleges refuse to be forthright on what the purpose of their affirmative action strategy is. And so the Supreme Court calls bullshit on them and says, can't do it then, right? Which I just think is a bad outcome for all of them. But they needed to, you have to say, I need to have this many of this group. I need to have this many women. I need to have this many, Hispanic kids. I need to have this many poor kids. It should be fine to say that because you're recognizing that the condition under which those kids will contribute and benefit from your educational system is a function in part of how many of them there are.
And you would say that the science backs this up, that this is why the magic third is potentially a universal law, that we see a whole lot of evidence that we have better outcomes, and that maybe we do need to be very intentional about having quotas. And you have this great case study, but it's hard to do. And you have this great case study of the Palo Alto Fair Play Committee in the 50s that settles a neighborhood in a pretty unusual way. That's a pretty interesting case study.
Yeah, it's a group of people get together and they are determined to fight white flight. All around them, urban neighborhoods are going from white to black as whites flee in terror to the suburbs. And they don't want that to happen. And the way they decide to fight white flight is to make sure that no individual ethnic group exceeds the magic third. In other words, if there is a threshold, at which point the neighborhood changes overnight, let's just stay below the threshold. So they have fixed proportions of blacks, whites, and Asians in there. A third, a third, a third. Nobody gets, if you're Asian and you want to sell your house, you got to sell it to an Asian person. If you're white, you got to sell it to a white person, right? And they stick to this for quite some time, for like a good 10, 15 years, and manage to keep it's a rare example in America in that era of a racially integrated neighborhood. And they do that by this kind of rigorous adherence to this notion of group proportions. And today, could you do that today? It's so like weird and problematic in today's environment. There's a point at which a black family wants to buy in, and the black families in what's called the Lawrence Tract turn down the black family because the black family would be buying a lot from a white person.
Yeah.
So they're forced to kind of turn their back on their own people in order to preserve the right of their own people to live in urban neighborhoods. It just becomes quickly very paradoxical and complicated. But that it interested me because one of the things I'm trying to do in this book is to point out how difficult a lot of these conversations around epidemics necessarily are.
Yeah. But it seems that at least for 10, 15 years that this works. I mean, that the accounts are that it's a really warm, wonderful neighborhood. And I think one of the stipulations was no two families of the same race could live next door to each other. Right. So it's this sort of deep, and this is in the 1950s when there are, riots and Jim Crow, and this is a pretty successful experiment. But as you say, it's heavy-handed and potentially illegal, right? To say you can't.
Well, it wouldn't be illegal in. Oh, actually. Oh, yeah, because the covenants. The Supreme Court strikes down covenants in 1948. But I wonder whether. Yeah. So today. I'm sure today it would not pass muster. Yeah.
Well, the third underappreciated driver of social contagions that you identify in this new book is super spreaders.
Yeah.
What do you think is the best example of the outsized impact of super spreaders?
COVID.
Yeah.
The chapter on COVID. The thing we don't realize until the very end of the pandemic is that the model we had in our heads for how transmission happened was wrong. That everyone who was infected with COVID was not posing an equal risk of transmitting the virus to someone else. In fact, the overwhelming majority of people posed a very low risk of transmission. And transmission was being done, in the most part, by a very small number of people who, when they spoke or breathed, produced an extraordinary number of aerosol particles laden with virus. And we don't understand really why the kind of graph of transmission is so asymmetrical. But it's not just mildly asymmetrical, it is profoundly asymmetrical. Like, out of 100 infected people, there will be like 2 in the room who are basically going to do all the transmission, and the others are going to be fine.
It's astounding, and it's actually measurable in the droplets. That certain individuals are just radiating a dramatically larger quantity of these kind of microscopic droplets of contagion.
Yeah, I had played with this idea. In the first tipping point, I have a chapter called "The Law of the Few," and I have these character types who I think play particularly important roles in spreading ideas or behaviors. But this is really one step beyond that. This is like what I had thought of as a asymmetrical phenomenon. I realized this time around was a profoundly asymmetrical phenomenon.
Yes, and unfortunately, this metaphor also applies to, or this phenomenon also applies to doctors prescribing OxyContin, right? To people who shouldn't be consuming it, or this isn't just COVID. There are a bunch of different areas in which this phenomenon.
Yeah, in the chapter when I talk about the opioid crisis, I get to I try to describe in as much detail as I can what exactly Purdue did to create an epidemic out of this drug, this painkiller. And part of what they did was to understand this epidemic principle of the super spreader. Only in their case, what they were interested in was, were there, strategy number one would be to reach every doctor who prescribed painkillers and try and convince them to use OxyContin. that would require a vast army of salespeople, and it would be really, really hard because most doctors did not want to prescribe OxyContin. They knew how dangerous it was. They were very, very selective in how many prescriptions they would write. So instead, what Purdue does, is adopt a strategy that was dreamt up by McKinsey, which was to say, oh, no, this works like an epidemic works. There's a small number of super spreader doctors who are the ones who will, if we can find those people who are very, very susceptible to our influence, who love being visited by drug reps, and who could be convinced to write tens of thousands of prescriptions, or thousands. And that's what they do. They figure out there's a couple thousand doctors in the entire country who are sufficient to create an epidemic that will engulf all of the United States. A guy in Tennessee, just outside of Nashville, who, and they would tell their sales reps, don't bother with 99% of your doctors on your call list. Just forget about them. They're not useful. Find the one guy who's like, who is for whatever reason is open to suggestion and the blandishments of a pharma sales rep, and just spend all of your time with that person.
Yeah. And there's a hero in this story, which is what's his name, Madden, the California
Madden.
Regulator, which, by the way, comes to mind because we just had a wonderful conversation with Yuval Noah Harari, and about his new book, and one of his comments was, we need people to tell more stories about bureaucracy and about bureaucrats who are heroes, because it's very hard for us to think of bureaucracies as forces for good.
Yeah.
But we need, perhaps now more than ever, looking forward, we need strong and healthy bureaucracies. And so this is kind of wonderful what happens, and we see it to this day, right? The astounding impact of what this guy did.
So Madden is basically head of the Bureau of Narcotics in California in the 40s. And he he's a kind of histrionic drug warrior, and is obsessed with how opioids are ravaging the population of California. And he has this idea that in California, if you're going to prescribe any drug that's a kind of heroin derivative, you have to use a 3-part prescription pad. And part 1 goes to the patient, they take to the pharmacy. Part 2 has to be kept by the doctor, and part 3 has to be sent to him at his headquarters in San Francisco. So he will have a record of every opioid prescribed in the state of California. And he will look at those records, and he will try and find patterns. And if he thinks you're prescribing too many, he's going to come and pay you a visit, right? But what the effect of that law is really that it's has a chilling effect on doctors' prescribing behavior. The doctors realize they're being watched, and they get really, really careful about how often they prescribe this most dangerous class of painkillers. And this is a simple bureaucratic, it's triplicate prescriptions are like started in California. For a time, no one else in the country follows suit. It's this weird thing that no one knows much about. And it's gradually picked up by a couple of other states around the country. And when the opioid crisis hits, those are the states that got off easiest in the epidemic. They had a legacy of restrained doctors, an overstory in place, if you like, that said to doctors, be careful, we're watching you. And tens of thousands of lives were saved by the kind of, in the aftermath of this weird, dude's fixation with opioids back in the 1940s.
And the Purdue sales team decided not to even waste any effort on the triplicate states. And you give this example of the difference between the state of New York and the state of Massachusetts, which are otherwise almost identical in terms of the rural poverty, or I guess the other indicators that people associate with the opioid epidemic. And I think the estimate was that 27,000 more people would have died in the state of New York had it not been a triplicate state.
Exactly. I mean,
Right,
we're
which
talking
is
about
astonishing.
The numbers here are astonishing. I mean, they really are. And you realize, I framed the book with my discussion of the opioid crisis because it is on such a scale, and is so relative to its catastrophic effects. I think it is relatively undiscussed in contemporary American discourse. I mean, think about how little discussion there is of it in the current presidential campaign.
Right,
I think
right.
it's probably our biggest social problem right now.
Right. And it's also preventable, right? It's understandable and preventable in a way that many things are not. Well, maybe one of the most surprising, perhaps the most surprising section of Revenge of the Tipping Point for me was about the Holocaust. A lot of information I was not familiar with at all. It turns out that if you walked up to a typical American on the street in, say, 1970 and asked them about the Holocaust, they would have had no idea what you were talking about.
Yeah. It's absent. First of all, it's not. We don't describe the atrocities in Germany as the Holocaust. That term is just not used. But more than that, we don't talk about it at all. I went back and looked at the textbooks that you would have had in freshman European history class in college, and all about the Second World War. There's nothing in there about the Holocaust. There's maybe a couple sentences, and this is true across the culture. There was only one Holocaust museum in the United States until the early 1980s, and that's I talk about the story of this place in LA, which was a kind of started by chance. A bunch of Holocaust survivors wanted to put their stuff somewhere. There was a it's this fascinating kind of study of how overstories work and how they change. Mm-hmm. But we had an overstory in place which said either we didn't want to talk about it, we didn't know how to talk about it, we were better off if you were a Holocaust survivor moving forward with your life and not dwelling on the past. And so we didn't talk about it. Just wasn't. And I talk about how that process changed, and it had to do with this this miniseries that runs on NBC in 1979. Is it 79? Yeah, 79. Which is like this, watched by half of Americans over 4 nights. It's called The Holocaust. And it's just this incredibly frank, graphic description of what happened in Germany in the war years. And it's like a light is switched on, and all of a sudden it becomes possible for Americans. And later the Holocaust is shown in Germany with similarly extraordinary effect. The overstory changes, and we realize we can talk about this problem. And that's, it's one of the most, you're right, everything in that chapter was new to me.
Yeah. No, well, and you describe that, that there were actually Holocaust museums proposed in the late 40s, like multiple times in New York. And different Jewish organizations were opposed to them for reasons that were somewhat understandable at the time.
Yeah, which was there was a feeling that anti-Semitism was fueled by perceptions of Jewish weakness. And that when Jews were seen as victims, they were easier to victimize. And so coming out of the war, there was a sense in the Jewish community that let's not play that card. Let's start over.
Yeah.
Let's project ourselves as strong. And there's nothing to be gained by revisiting this horrific episode.
Yeah.
And I do think it was understandable. I think that there's nothing in this chapter judgmental about the way the Holocaust was treated in the past. It's just a kind of description of.
this kind of collective decision not to talk about it included even concentration camp survivors, right? Which you describe as maybe feeling some sense of shame, oddly. But it was collectively among Jews and Gentiles, there was just a kind of decision not to talk about it a lot.
Yeah.
And then, as you say, this television show Holocaust comes out, and this is in the time of three networks, massive viewing audiences, and 120 million people tune in. And the date I have here is April 16th, 1978, to watch the first of this miniseries, which is half of the entire population of the United States.
It's incredible.
And you share in the book a chart of the use of the word Holocaust, which was almost non-existent, and soars.
Mm-hmm.
And within a decade, we have museums across the country. And I think you say thousands of museums in Germany. It had a
similar catalytic effect
yeah.
in Germany as well. Yeah, no, it's this weird thing. There's nothing for 40 years, and then boom, there's suddenly becomes something that we can talk about and enters the kind of culture. And it's an astonishing a kind of case study in how these kinds of contagious processes work.
This actually made me nostalgic for the days of early television, which I haven't felt, right? Because, which we remember the three networks. You and I are old enough to remember those days and playing with the rabbit ear, putting tinfoil on the antennas. But I mean, the quality of television programming was pretty lousy. Is my recollection back then in comparison with today. And yet, arguably, this kind of inoffensive, often uninspired programming that we were all watching mm-hmm. was doing something kind of healthy for us collectively, because it gave us this common overstory, right? I mean, there was there was something happening there that turned out to be pretty salubrious for the broader connectedness of the nation.
I think that's right. There, if you think of on the continuum, quality's at one end and power's at the other, and we gave up power for quality.
Right.
Power came from collective viewing experiences, from the fact that when the whole country watches a show for 4 consecutive nights, that's power, right?
Yeah.
But that's only possible in a world where you don't have 50 different channels and multiple different voices, all kind of improving the overall quality of the content.
Yeah. The show that I remember was watching the day after, which yeah. I just pulled it up, aired on November 20th, 1983. Did you see that? You were in Canada. I don't know if it was the same.
I remember it.
Yeah.
I never.
But it was this it was a post-apocalyptic, nuclear
right.
war, depiction that everyone I knew all watched, and we were just sort of pallid the next day, walking around, just terrified of this possibility of nuclear apocalypse. But it was, it connected the whole society in having a common sense of a problem to be solved, and politically. So you cite in the book the work of Larry Gross, who did this fascinating bit of research that showed that the more television people watched of all ideological persuasions, the more they started to agree, right? Yeah. Which is a
fascinating,
interesting,
and hugely timely insight. And we have a keen appreciation of what we're missing at the moment.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned at the top of the show that the first thought I had when I saw your title of your latest book, Revenge at the Tipping Point, was that maybe this was going to be related to technology. Second thought I had was maybe there was going to be a response to your critics in the Revenge. But but I guess the tipping point did not receive a whole lot of criticism, and you have a history, or I think of you as being wonderfully unfazed by your critics.
Well,
but
the person who responds, the person who criticizes the tipping point the most is going to be me, because I have a revisionist history episode coming out right around the time of publication, which is a quite unstinting response to the crime chapter in the original Tipping Point. So I decided to usurp my critics by beating them to the punch.
Interesting, right? Because that was the one. Yeah, that was the one chapter that I was aware of there having been at least a meaningful revision of the collective assessment of what it was that resulted in the decrease in crime in New York. That the broken window explanation is not as well regarded today as it was perhaps then.
Yeah, I think that makes So I didn't want to put it in the book. It didn't seem to fit in this book, but there's some things that make more sense in a podcast. So that episode will come out in the next couple of weeks. We just tracked it today, as a matter of fact.
Oh, great. Yeah. I look forward to that, because we've read about other triggers like the end of the crack epidemic, the lead poisoning, and the impact of legalized abortion, which are a number of other interesting possible explanations. So we'll have to tune in to learn more about your revised assessment.
Watch this space.
Okay. So on the topic of critics, I was I was looking for some sort of withering criticism, Malcolm, for you to respond to. See if we could put a little sizzle here on the show, because you're so good at this. And Steven Pinker, in a review of your essay collection, What the Dog Saw, said, "The common thread in Gladwell's writing is a kind of populism which seeks to undermine the ideals of talent, intelligence, and analytical prowess in favor of luck, opportunity, experience, and intuition." Now, that's not necessarily a criticism, actually.
I was going to say that if that's withering criticism, I'm doing very well.
I should say no. I wasn't wildly successful, but do you think, does that resonate for you?
Probably. I'm not I'm not as, I probably don't. I think it is a very useful thing for a journalist to do, to undermine people's preconceptions about their own success. And in my experience, successful people tend to commit a kind of fallacy, which is they think of, is it Freud? Every man is a hero of his own story, or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's that, right?
Yeah.
It is a very good thing for society if we make determined attempts to kind of erode that misconception. And so I think Pinker is spot on.
Well, what I see in your work, I just relished reading Revenge of the Tipping Point, as I have your previous books. And what I see in your work and style, which to me explains both its enormous popularity and its utility, is that you tend to walk the reader through your process of discovering something new about the world. Here's something puzzling. Consider this. There's also this. Your first assumption might be this, but you'd be wrong. In fact, it's that. And it's a detective story about what we can ascertain about the truth of the world that includes a delight in being wrong. Right? And seeking out counterfactuals, revising opinions, and here you are in your revisionist history episode about to criticize your first Tipping Point book. But I see this as both highly entertaining for me as a reader, and also edifying and useful for the world, encouraging people to delight in the process of figuring out how the world works and revising their understandings. Does that describe to you at all what you're setting out to do?
I mean, there's nothing, in my experience, there are a few things more pleasurable than having the opportunity to update your knowledge of the world,
Yeah.
amend your preconceptions, do, all of that is, or just flat out find out that you were wrong. There's like, it's like an opportunity to start over.
Yes.
It's like the experience, as a kid, you would read a book and I would read a book. I don't know what other people did. And I would misunderstand it. Then I'd read it a second time and I'd go, oh, that was the killer, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I've never gotten over the kind of particular pleasure that comes from reversing your kind of understanding.
Right.
And
but a lot of people find this very painful, right? To revise their opinions and their conception of the world, right? I mean, for a lot of people, their perception of the world is pretty locked.
My dad liked to change his mind. I just thought that was fantastic whenever he.
Yeah.
It was, I think in his mind, it was an opportunity. You got to, because he was a mathematician. If you found out you were wrong, then you got a new paper out. It's like,
right.
It just opened up possible. Half of the possibilities, wonderful possibilities that presented themselves to him came out of him understanding that he had made a mistake before or had overlooked something. So that's always been my perspective.
Yes, and our institution of science and academia rewards revision and discovery, and this is how we get Nobel Prizes.
That's a lovely thing. It's only in politics where we don't let people change their minds. I just find that ridiculous.
Right.
Yeah, that kind of bias. So and so's flip flopping. Well, I hope I flip flop every day. It's people. You want some consistency in values, but not in beliefs.
Yes.
That's the distinction that's lacking.
Yeah. Well, my last question for you, Malcolm. How has the story that you tell yourself about yourself changed? We might call this the Malcolm Gladwell overstory.
Oh. Well, when I wrote The Tipping Point, I considered myself to be not very hardworking. Now, that might have been an illusion.
Right.
But, and now I'm much more interested in hard work as a kind of causal explanation for why good things happen to people. I now, I just think it's the single most important thing. Do you want to work hard? And and everything flows from that. And I would not have said that when I was, in fact, when I was at the Washington Post, I had a reputation for being a little bit lazy.
Huh.
So I don't think anyone would say that about me now. But, so that's been the principle. I just wasn't as interested in hard work as I am now.
That's so interesting because a wonderful line I counted recently from Michael Lewis, it was that he self-identified as being lazy, or his resting place is inertia, but he said that indolence serves for him as a filter for the projects that he takes on. And of course, this is a man who's written like 23 books, right? So he's obviously not, from the perspective of the outside world, indolent.
That's
but
funny.
That he only takes on projects if they just spark powerful responses of joy and curiosity and engagement.
Yeah.
And so he sees this indolence as a really useful filter, which I kind of love. Maybe that was where the young Malcolm Gladwell was mentally.
Yeah.
Waiting for the tipping point. Well, thank you, Malcolm, for being with us today. Such a
Thank
great
you, Rufus.
great
This
conversation.
is so much fun.
Yeah, wonderful.
And thank you for being such a generous reader. And thank you for the fact that when you looked for vigorous critics of my work, the best you could come up with is what sounded like a compliment, a rare compliment from Steven Pinker. So,
I'm not convinced that he meant it as a compliment, but nonetheless,
Yeah,
I think I think taking it as one is the right
He and
the right
I
decision.
don't always see eye to eye, but
Yeah.
thank you, Rufus.